It's normally been the job of the president to introduce the annual Rolt lecture. I am no longer president. There's enough presidents around here to do it one way or the other. But those of you will remember that LTC Rolt was the founder of AIA, and we set up this lecture every this stage of the conference every time in order to celebrate the life of Tom Rolt. And many speakers who spoke remembered Tom Rolt. I think I might have been one of the few who didn't, and I was probably the first of those who didn't remember Tom Rolt. But today's talk is taking a slightly different approach, because we wanted here in Bath to celebrate the life of Angus Buchanan and of Brenda as well. And you've already heard about the major role that was played here in the foundation of industrial archaeology, as well of the history of technology. So I'm starting off as an academic, because my link with Angus was partly academic and partly involved with the National Trust, which a lot of people don't know, I think, how much Angus did for the National Trust. After that, Keith is going to talk from a much more personal point of view. We're delighted to welcome Tom Buchanan, who is going to give an even more personal view of his father. And then with Neil at the front, we are going to have a more informal session with memories of Angus and Brenda from those who knew him personally best. I just wanted to say that Angus was a historian. He did his history degree at Cambridge. I'm a historian. I did mine at the other place. I'm an archaeologist, which Angus wasn't. And I'm by no means a historian of technology, which Angus certainly was. But I followed in his footsteps all my professional life. He and Neil, as you will hear, ran evening classes here in Bristol, in the Bristol Folk House. I did the same in Vaughan College in Leicester, founded in Leicester to educate working men in the 1970s and 1980s. I was his external examiner for his course here on the history of science and technology in the 1980s, when the University of Bath was a great deal smaller. I didn't recognize it when we arrived. I served with him on the National Trust Industrial Archaeology panel for many years and succeeded him on the Trust's archaeology panel. And then I finally succeeded him as a commissioner with the Royal Commission on the Historic Monuments of England, as it was then, in 1993. So I followed him all my working life, and I owe him a very great tribute. Just a little about his work for the National Trust before I just go on to some of the academic side of things. Angus served on the panel, as I've just said, the National Trust Archaeology panel, and he was largely responsible for the takeover by the National Trust of the site that some of you might know, the Finch Foundry, a 19th century water-powered forge near Sticklepath at Oakhampton in Devon. He served on the Trust's Properties Committee, as it then was. And at the time, the National Trust was becoming aware, under David Thackeray, their archaeologist, of the growing importance of industrial archaeology. And that was the time of Enterprise Neptune, when they were really working on to save much of the Cornish coastline in particular. So the Sticklepath foundry, the Finch Foundry, remained an active foundry until 1960, when the roof collapsed. But thanks to Angus, it became a National Trust property in 1994, with its water wheels and tools maintained in working order and demonstrations given. He also served as a non-archaeologist on the archaeology panel of the National Trust. But the increasing interest in industrial archaeology led to the setting up of an industrial archaeology panel within the National Trust, which Angus chaired. And I served on that with Peter Neveson and with David Thackeray. as the National Trust archaeologist. I eventually took over the chairmanship of that from Angus and replaced him on the archaeology panel, on which I served for 22 years. Now, the meetings of the Industrial Archaeology Group took place in the National Trust offices in Cirencester, as it then was. One of our tasks was to make visits to National Trust land where industrial activities had taken place, to check on their accessibility, their safety information, their interpretations, and so on. As you can see, a lot of them were not exactly what you might call safe. One memorable excavation, I'm sure you all recognize this, and part of it on the AIA poster outside, was to the Cornish coast, saved by the Trust under Enterprise Neptune. And it's the copper and tin industries of that area that is definitely on the AIA poster outside. And we had to walk around all these sites. Angus fell very heavily, and we were very worried about him on this particular trip, but fortunately he recovered. This is Truawa's Head, where the National Trust eventually undertook quite an extensive restoration project, as you can see. The problem was that choughs nest there for part of the year, and they could only work on this building when the choughs weren't nesting. So much of it took place in the winter, which was somewhat difficult. We were also asked to go to Snowdonia, not long after the Trust took over the north face of Snowdon from the Vaynell estate. And we had to check on the precarious state of open mine shafts from the former copper mines as well, the former copper mines over towards Keswick. We stayed at the Pennygurid Hotel, which I'm sure many of you know, from which you climb the pig track up Snowdon. And this is the hotel in which the Everest climbers trained. And if you've ever been there, their inscriptions are all over the walls. And that's why Angus and David were very keen to stay there in order to see all these. But we then went to the Force Crag mine in Cumbria. And a lot of walking was involved in this, a lot of climbing, a lot of scrambling around. Angus was then in his late 60s, but he took it all in his stride, literally. That's the Keswick part of the copper mines at Coniston. My last visit with him as a National Trust representative, and Sir Neil might remember this, was to the Chatterley Whitfield Colliery when Sir Neil was director of English Heritage. And we're really looking at whether the National Trust could afford to take this site on. As you know, they didn't. But after that, I took Angus to a local pub of the sort I don't think he'd ever been into before, in parts of Stoke-on-Trent. Now, that's a photograph many of you have seen of Angus. It's been published many times, looking very quizzical, but that great library behind him. I wanted just to think about how Angus, despite not being an archaeologist himself, laid the foundations for the discipline of industrial archaeology. We've said a lot this morning about the restoration grants, about the objects that the AIA is managing to have restored with funding from our anonymous donors. But you will remember, I hope, from yesterday morning that our European speakers spoke a great deal about industrial archaeology in the context of cultural activity and so on in their various countries. And you might remember the slide that was shown by Helmuth Albrecht of that superb procession on the day that the World Heritage status for the Erzgebirge mining site was declared, and the amount of work they were doing on embedding the industrial sites within the cultural context of that area. And in his great book on industrial archaeology in Britain that he published in 1972, which had a great influence, it was a Pelican original, so it had great influence in the publishing world as well. He said, "The study of industrial archaeology is archaeological insofar as it deals with physical objects and requires field work, even if the excavatory techniques of the classical archaeologist are not often applicable. That was his book, which I'm sure you all have in the second edition. But he was talking at the same time as the landscape historian W.G. Hoskins was writing his Making of the English Landscape. And they both, at that time, as was common, thought only of archaeology as digging below the ground. We now know, thanks to Time Team and Geophys and all the rest of it, that half of archaeology is above ground and not necessarily concerned with excavation. And so things have changed. But I think Angus laid the foundations for what we do in two fundamental ways. Firstly, the practical element of the discipline he described in considerable detail in that book, investigating, surveying, recording, and preserving industrial monuments. But then secondly, he added, we needed to assess the significance of these monuments in the context of social and technological history, which was echoed very much by our European speakers. He felt that physical evidence acquired in the archaeological manner could be used to inform what he called a major understanding of the process of industrialization in Britain, one of, if not the first country to industrialize. So the origins of industrial archaeology are very well known, and I'm not going to go into all those now. We all probably know that Michael Ricks, the staff tutor in architectural history in the University of Birmingham, said in his article in the Amateur Historian in 1955, there are still many monuments to be scheduled, many books to be written, and much field work to be done before industrial archaeology can take its rightful place among the studies of these islands. What, of course, Angus did was to make that possible for industrial monuments to be recognized and scheduled by creating the first record of surviving industrial structures from the past in the form of the National Monuments Record here in Bath. And obviously Keith will enlarge on this because he eventually was involved in this. The idea of making written and photographic records of industrial remains in Britain came from the Council for British Archaeology, founded in 1944 in response to wartime devastation, but it was always very quick to respond to new developments. And in 1959, a small group met in London to discuss how industrial archaeology might best be developed, or indeed what to call it, because that has always been a problem. The definition they came up with, and I quote from the CBA files, the subject should be considered for practical purposes as post-medieval, but so as to include all interested in the field, the term industrial archaeology was adopted rather than the archaeology of the industrial age, which would have confined it to a definite period. So that's really where the name industrial archaeology properly came from, those CBA discussions, and obviously Michael Ricks's work in Birmingham. The CBA recognised quite rightly that they were not going to get any help from government ministries or statutory bodies at the time to carry out with this survey and recording for a pilot survey of industrial monuments and to create a basic record card. And this is one that Angus gave me himself. And you'll see that when you read it carefully, the whole of New Lanark is recorded on one card. But that's how it all really started. Sites were recorded in a very basic way. And those of us who did them sent them off to Angus in Bath eventually. But to start with, the CBA had no room for these cards. They hadn't got the staff to catalogue them. And Rex Wales, who was the part-time survey officer for the CBA, a post that Keith finally took from him, he suggested that the Centre for the Study of the History of Technology at Bath University, or Bristol College of Science and Technology, as it then was, which Angus had founded, should be invited to undertake the creation of a central classified record from these cards, which became known as the National Record of Industrial Monuments, or NRIM, which has gone through various changes since Angus first did that. He accepted that invitation, and from 1955 onwards, we could send him these cards. They were copied and returned to sender, hopefully to be placed in local repositories. Record offices, in the form we know them now, were in their infancy to some extent. Angus wrote in the Industrial Archaeologist's Guide in 1969 that the system was not perfect. He said the quality of the cards varied from those which were so badly written as to be unintelligible, or so vague as to be useless at one end of the scale, to the carefully written, drawn, and illustrated cards at the other end, like this one, packing a great deal of valuable information. And then, of course, Keith became the CBA's first survey officer in this category in, I think, 1971. Angus admitted that the national record would take a very long time to complete, and he asked those who were making these record cards to stop sitting on them and writing their books, using them, but to send them to him, which is where they were supposed to go. So that is what stimulated so many people really to start these gazetteers of sites in the counties, and to search out really what remained of the structures of past industry in their own areas. And so we have all the gazetteers that were published, and there is a one of Bristol that I'm sure many of us will show you, but this was one of the first ones, this one of Staffordshire. This was the firm, of course, of David and Charles, found by David St. John Thomas and Charles Hadfield, the canal expert. And you will all know, because I gave you quite a lot of mine yesterday, that the AIA has published a gazetteer in many of the, in most, in fact, of the areas in which it's held its annual conference. So by the 1980s, we had a pretty good idea of what remained from the early days of British industrialization, and had gone a long way to preserving many of them, mostly, of course, by volunteer effort. So to the second effort, the second element in Angus's definition of industrial archaeology, which was to assess the significance of what had survived from the past in the context of social and technological history. Now, as I'm sure Neil will elaborate on, as you can see, the book published jointly by Angus and himself. Angus said that the city of Bristol and its surrounding districts had experienced continuous industrial activity for longer than any region in Britain, except London, but the rapid loss of monuments in that area had made the systematic analysis of industrial archaeology in the area a matter of urgency, because so much was disappearing. But to move on from that, the cover indicates where his interests were going, as you can see from the figure of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. In 2006, Angus published the definitive work on Isambard Kingdom Brunel, The Life and Times of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. But Angus was a prolific publisher. Before that, he'd already written The Engineers, A History of the Engineering Profession in Britain in 1989, and The Power of the Machine, The Impact of Technology from 1977 to the present day. So he wrote that, but his interests were very much in Brunel and in moving towards the history of technology and the history of engineering, which is obviously where his main interest lay. My own academic work was inevitably going the other way into justifying industrial archaeology. Angus was based in a Centre for the History of Technology. I was head of a large department of archaeology, and I had to justify my existence to my prehistoric and Roman colleagues. So it went rather in a different way. So as I said at the beginning, I very much followed Angus throughout his life. He's the greatest influence on my academic career of anyone. One of the few university-based academics interested in the study of past industrial structures. And you saw 3 more of them on the screen yesterday, who are all having problems, I think, in maintaining their position in their respective universities. Angus and I both began by teaching adult education classes, where we learned as much as we taught, of course. And that was the way in which much of this began. It was in adult education groups around the country, particularly, of course, here in Bristol. Angus and Brenda moved on to play a large part in the International Committee for the History of Technology and to work on the lives of the engineers. I had to undertake more practical survey and excavation than Angus did, but at heart, we were both historians by training, and we were looking at interpreting the remains of past industry in the context of social, economic, and technological history, an aspect of our careers that I don't intend to pursue today. But Mike Novell has written quite a lot on this in the various publications that he's brought out in recent years. But I hope much of it was explained in 2005, gosh, it's that long ago, in the research framework that AIA brought out in response to the work that English Heritage was doing at the time on creating these large research frameworks in trying to direct people into some sort of framework of research. But that's another story, which I'm not going to go into now. So it's nice to share with you my memories of Angus Buchanan here. I didn't know Angus and Brenda personally as well as Neil or Keith, or of course, Tom Buchanan, who will speak to us as well at the end of this session. But he was for me the great inspiration who laid the foundations for my own career. So I will now pass over to Keith, who moved into the CBA.
Thank you. My contribution this morning is somewhat different from Marilyn's. We've coordinated anything. It is very much a personal appreciation of a friendship that lasted 50 years. It's very much a chronology rather than an analysis or an assessment of Angus's work. But I think if I can bring in all the different elements that happened over those 50 years, you'll get some sort of idea of his tremendous contribution, and also Brenda's somewhat later, to our field of study. It's unashamedly personal, as our friendship and my honorary research fellowship at this university only ended with their death. They both died during lockdown in 2020. I first met Angus when he was on my interview board for the post of CBA Industrial Survey Officer in 1971. The post, which was state-funded, was a full-time replacement for Rex Wales, who had been part-time consultant to survey since 1962. The post was originally to be based at the CBA's headquarters in Regent's Park. But Angus, as one of the 13 members of their CBA Research Committee on Industrial Archaeology, also offered an option to host the post at the new university that was being developed at Bath, and at that time was home to the National Record of Industrial Monuments. When, in May 1971, I was offered the post, which was initially for just 3 years, Angus invited me to visit the university to ascertain whether I'd wish to be based there rather than in London. Accordingly, my wife and I travelled down to Bath that month. Such was the warmth of our reception, both at the university and by Brenda, who invited us home for a meal with the family. Tom Buchanan was just perhaps a young teenager or less. We had no hesitation in choosing to come to Bath. Now, more than 50 years later, we have never regretted that decision. So what was it that Angus had actually invited me to join? The Centre for the Study of History and Technology, with Angus as its director, had been formed at the Bristol College of Science and Technology in the spring of 1964 at Angus's own suggestion. It was advised by a council chaired by Sir Arthur Elton, with Tom Rolt as its vice chair, two names that will crop up throughout, and comprised 13 members, 6 of whom, including Ken Hudson, editor of the then Journal of Industrial Archaeology, were internal members of staff, and 7 of whom, including Neil Cousins, were outside experts in various aspects of technology. From its creation, the Angus Centre began an association with the Council of British Archaeology, which was to produce profound effects, which Marilyn has shown about the record card. But as we heard from Marilyn, the CBA couldn't deal with their own record cards when they were returned, so that the task was transferred to the centre, where George Watkins, the renowned expert on stationary steam engines, undertook much of the administrative chores. Thus, with those facilities on offers, the ongoing maintenance of the National Record of Industrial Monuments, and the presence of like-minded colleagues had made Bath my obvious choice, while available expertise of George Watkins on stationary steam engines, Owen Ward on water mills, and David Brooks on railways was an added bonus. In the years immediately prior to my arrival, Angus's Centre had organised a series of Bath conferences on industrial archaeology, which had drawn a national and latterly international participation. I mentioned some of this on Friday night. Indeed, at the 1968 conference, a resolution was passed calling for the formation of a national body to promote the interests and objectives of industrial archaeology, the proto-AIA. It also suggested strengthening the functions of the CBA. Now, the first idea, which the CBA actually backed, to form a new, some sort of association or society, came to nothing at the time. The second suggestion was fulfilled when the CBA secured additional state funding for the creation of my post a couple of years later. The Bath conferences were certainly to lay the foundation for the first National Industrial Archaeology Conference in Bradford in September 1971. And at the second National Conference at Glasgow, Sir Arthur Elton, again, proposed at the following conference at the Isle of Man that a National Society for Industrial Archaeology should be formed. Thus, Angus had had a major part to play in the courtship, the conception, and the birth of AIA. Indeed, he was elected vice chair of the AIA on the Isle of Man in 1963 and succeeded Tom Rolt as chairman when, unfortunately, Tom was to die the following spring. So the inaugural meeting of the AIA was chaired by Angus. As a member of the centre and a CBA employee, I thus had ready introduction to most of the main British players in the subject. Shortly after I joined, a Fulbright scholar, Eric Deloney, on secondment from the Historic American Engineering Record, spent a term in Bath and brought an even wider international perspective to the centre. Eric went on 30 years later with Hare to become its chief and a major contributor to Tiki searches on bridges, etc. And with Tiki, When the first International Conference on Conservation of Industrial Monuments was conceived by Neil and his staff at the newly created Ironbridge Gorge Museum and held at Attingham Park nearby, this circle of contacts, which Angus had cultivated, assumed an international dimension as some of the leading overseas delegates had attended the Bath Conference. George Watkins' name has cropped up a couple of times already. A major early coup by Angus for the centre was the appointment as a research assistant in 1965 of George, a Bristolian engineer in his 60s, who had spent most of his spare time recording stationary steam engines still in use throughout the 1930s and on right into the 1960s. George, in the mid-1950s, had actually published through the Newcomb Society a little of his research, but his collection of photographs, together with his descriptive notes and information about steam engine makers, was kept in sacks in his rented lodgings. At the centre, he was able to get excellent prints made from his negatives and get these mounted in his explanatory notes printed with reverse on mounts. Latterly, when George was in his when he was in his 70s, he could no longer be employed by the university. They had extended it beyond their normal cut-off time. And then he was to occupy a corner of my room in the university. And his collection of over 1,000 mounted cards and a filing cabinet were there, and his notes, which were to provide a sort of accessible encyclopedic source of technological information. Thus, the Industrial Monument Survey reports, such as subjects on steam pumping engines in the water industry, were easily compiled from George's notes. Angus was also able to harness George and shape George's unrivaled knowledge on steam engines to produce, as you see, numerous books on the subject, starting with the stationary steam engine published in 1968, followed in the 1970s by volumes on the textile mill engines, 2 volumes on steam engine in industry, and 2 books actually co-authored with Angus, The Man and the Steam Engine and the Industrial Archaeology of the Steam Engine. When I finally left the university to move to the Royal Commission Historical Monuments Office in Salisbury in 1984, George's material in my room was moved there. And it indeed was, my children worked on some of it, photocopying it. And when he died in 1989, Angus, John Cornwall, and I had to clear his lodgings before his possessions were binned. And his remaining material was rushed to the university, where it's now carefully archived. His mounted photographs and notes are now housed in the Royal Commission successor, English Heritage, now Historic England's archive in Swindon. And there they provide the basis of a 10-volume series edited by Tony Woolridge and published by Landmark Press from the years 2000 to 2006. And that takes up the rest of the page. Also, when Tom Rolt died, the Rolt Fellowship was established, as you see, in 1978, to commemorate his life. And in fact, when you look at the 14 Rolt Fellows, an inspector of factories, a naval engineer, chartered engineer, all these sort of things, some very well known, David Brown, Naval Construction, he was head of the naval architecture in MOD. This provided an amazing amount of expertise. Mike Bowen published on breweries in Bath, this sort of thing. So that, again, I was surrounded by, at least once a term, people who I could sort of glean knowledge from on various subjects that I needed. But as I just mentioned, I moved to the Royal Commission of Historical Monuments in 1984. That was because in the early years, the management of survey was transferred in 1977 from the Council of British Archaeology to the Directorate of Ancient Monuments and Historic Buildings. But I was to continue to be based here as survey officer, but now funded as a member of university staff, with my DofE advisory role significantly increased, but then limited to England and Wales. Scotland having established its own survey based at Strathclyde University, and Miles Oglethorpe was appointed survey officer up there, who we've seen quite a bit at the conference. From 1967, the survey had compiled a list of sites deemed worthy of protection, and which was presented roughly quarterly to a panel composed of representatives of national heritage agencies and museums, and Angus was secretary. When the panel met last in 1980, some 2,325 sites in total had been considered by the panel. More than 2,000 in England, 125 in Scotland, and 100 or so in Wales. With the inception of the DofE's accelerated survey of listed buildings in 1980, the identification of historic industrial sites worthy of protection became an integral part of the work of a cohort of 80 contract field staff. They were briefed on industrial heritage assessments by me as consultant under the auspices of the Royal Commission Historical Monuments. The Royal Commission had not been able to recruit me into their number because of a ban on government, such organisations expanding at that time. But my work with them commenced a new chapter in my relationship with Angus. Angus himself was appointed in 1981 as a Royal Commissioner for the Royal Commission Historical Monuments, and he was specifically responsible for industrial heritage. And as I said, my responsibilities had been transferred to Royal Commission, so that we were able to work together closely on supervising many of the Royal Commission's surveys of industrial sites. The NMR itself, the NRMM, the National Record of Industrial Monuments, which Angus had been curating, was closed and transferred to the National Monuments Record for archiving. Angus was involved very much in the industrial work of the Royal Commission, including a range of books, which I will mention in a moment. Indeed, the relationship at Bath was further cemented by the appointment of a member of staff from the Southampton office to work on the National Archaeological Record here at Bath. With the funding tie with the university was finally severed in 1984, and I was transferred to the Royal Commission staff when an embargo was lifted against expansion. And I was appointed to the Salisbury office, and no longer a member of university staff, obviously. But I continued to stay with the Centre as a visiting research fellow. In 1994, the Royal Commission's Salisbury office was relocated to Swindon, where the Royal Commission had established its own headquarters in the railway works in the former General Manager's office. The relationship which had developed with Hare in America was maintained in the form of exchange of internships. One such US intern, Laurie Ward, produced a record of the mason's marks inscribed on the then derelict entrance lock to the Somerset Coal Canal. In fact, we will see that lock, which has now been restored, so we won't be able to see the mason's marks. That's on Tuesday if anybody is coming on the Kensington Canal. When Angus's term as Royal Commissioner came to an end after 12 years, to recognise his invaluable input and to promote the increased output of industrial work. A programme of Royal Commission annual Buchanan seminars was instigated, covering such topics as the Portsmouth block mills, Swindon Railway Works, and indeed the Watkins collection. For this last event, Angus had re-edited George's work on the textile mill engine from 2 volumes into a single volume, with National Monuments record staff reassembling the photographs from the collection. Finally, in 1999, the Royal Commission merged with English Heritage, and my membership of the Centre's existing relationship with the schools, my membership of the Centre and English Heritage's existing relationship with the School of Architecture and Civil Engineering were to provide a focus here at Bath, provide a focus for joint initiatives. And we continued the series of Buchanan seminars and a symposium on proposals for a Great Western Railway World Heritage Site, which almost achieved something. And in all this work, we were much bolstered by the appointment of Sir Neil Cousins as chairman of English Heritage in 2000. Throughout that period, the university, English Heritage, the Borough of Swindon, STEAM, the Science Museum at Rotten, and various other stakeholders such as the National Trust and the Railway Heritage Committee were in detailed discussion over the formation of an institute provisionally named AIA, the Institute for Scientific, Architectural, Industrial, and Archaeological Heritage. There was even a temporary campus for the University of Bath and Swindon. Although this university's tentative venture into Swindon eventually came to naught, as did the proposed MSc course on the conservation of industrial heritage and the World Heritage nomination of the Great Western Railway. Others initiatives, such as the prestigious Brunel 2006 Symposium, were very successful. Angus was to maintain my visiting research fellow status. This led to my advisory oversight on several MSc conservation postgraduate dissertations on subjects such as industrial heritage of Taiwan, Brunel's small stations, and the reuse of Southwest textile mills. As we've seen, it also, George Watkins' books were turned into a magnificent series of 10 volumes. In 2012, I retired from English Heritage. My association with Angus continued with involvement with the Centre and seminar and publications. To return to Angus and Brenda, I've said very little about Brenda so far. She had been a mother, a teacher, and when in her spare time, which was not very much, a very effective researcher on things. She now had registered for a PhD, and in my recollections of that time, she was always an equal partner with Angus, whether it was hospitality, traveling to Bochum, for instance, in 1976 to Tiki, and she really, I think, backed up Angus's research and his management in a way that's it's hard to to quantify. Anyway, it was through her joint association with the International Committee on the History of Technology that Brenda was to emerge from Angus's shadow as an international guru on gunpowder. Alcatech itself had been set up in 1968, and Angus had represented the Newcomen Society at its inauguration. And then in 1981, Angus became its General Secretary, and 1983, its President. The following year, it held its symposium in Bath. Hence the image of Brenda firing a courtesy salute. This was courtesy of the old Wardour Castle garrison. From the 1960s, Angus had also been a member of SHOT, which is a Society for the History of Technology based in the US. And in 1989, SHOT awarded Angus its Leonardo da Vinci Medal at its meeting in Sacramento. Occasional such visits to annual meetings of SHOT gave both Angus and Brenda and family the opportunity to give lectures and courses in institutions such as the Divner Institute at MIT, Fort Ligonier, and the University of Delaware. Brenda had also ventured into publication when she was researching her PhD, and which was on the 18th century financing of industrial ventures in the Bristol and Bath area. This covered numerous aspects of the subject, including turnpike roads. Macadam's major contributions were done in the Bath area. River navigations, which included, of course, the Avon navigation, one of the most important river navigations improved in the early 18th century. Wasteland enclosure, and crucially for our understanding of the subject, gunpowder production. Her first essay into this subject was in 1981 with a joint article by Malcolm Tucker, who I think is present here today, in Industrial Archaeology Review, and entitled The Manufacture of Gunpowder, a study of the documentary and physical evidence relating to the woolly gunpowder works near Bath. In 1994, at the meeting of ICTEC, Brenda was persuaded by Angus to convene a gathering of international scholars interested in gunpowder. The 24 papers presented at that meeting, edited by Brenda, was published by Bath University Press, entitled Gunpowder, the History of an International Technology. And to everyone's surprise, it became a bestseller and had to be reprinted. That was one of the first international books on the subject. It was followed by several articles and indeed was reprinted in 2006 when Brenda's second edited magnum opus, Gunpowder, Explosives and the State, A Technological History, appeared. With my Royal Commission colleagues and later English Heritage colleagues, I very much benefited from Brenda's acknowledged expertise in gunpowder. When we were recording gunpowder sites all around the country, from Cumbria, Kent, and especially at Waltham Abbey, one of my junior colleagues, Wayne Cowcroft, who is a medieval historian and archaeologist, became the main expert in gunpowder following Brenda. She was very much a mentor to Wayne. In fact, Brenda's reputation was such that she was nominated by the Science Museum as their trustee on the Waltham Abbey Royal Gunpowder Works Site Trust, a post she served and very much enjoyed from 1997 to 2007. Another string to Brenda's bow was as editor and contributor to Bath History. In 1986, she helped set up the History of Bath Research Group, and after a spell as chairman, she took on the editorship of Bath History in 1994 and produced 5 volumes over the next 10 years. Given all these outstanding contributions to so many aspects of industrial history, I was delighted to be and honored to be able to nominate her as a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. To conclude, perhaps surprisingly, I have not touched much on Angus's prodigious work on Brunel. It is so well known that it has warranted his collection and book being curated at the Brunel Institute in Bristol. But apart from involvement with the Bicentennial Symposium in 2006, and my own work on Brunel and Swindon, as not much involved in this work. In 1993, Angus was honoured with the award of an OBE for services to the history of technology, and retired from the university in 1995, but now as an emeritus professor, remained honorary director of the Centre of Technology. In 2012, the centre was renamed the History of Technology Research Unit, HOTRU, with Angus as director and Brenda and myself as visiting research fellows. And HOTRU continued until Angus's death in 2020. The Engineering Revolution, published only 2 years before Angus died, is very much a tribute to those years. You've seen this photograph before. I've only been able to give a glimpse into tremendous contribution that Angus and Brenda have made over some 60 years to the development of industrial archaeology, both nationally and internationally. Angus's approach to the subject was ostensibly from the perspective of the history of technology, but had a much wider influence on the appreciation of industrial heritage, locally, nationally, and internationally. I was fortunate that Angus and Brenda had a delightfully friendly way, would me and my wife Eileen to Bath back in 1971, and over the succeeding half-century, we shared a host of very personal occasions. These continued long after professional ties had concluded and only terminated with their deaths during lockdown in 2020. This photograph was taken, as you see, on celebrating their diamond wedding anniversary, 2016. I leave you with a photograph of Angus and Brenda. Enjoy yourselves. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Okay, well, first of all, I really want to say on behalf of the family, which is my wife, Julia, who's here today, my brother, Andy, and his wife, Mary Nell, who live in upstate New York, so can't be with us, just how grateful we are that the AIA decided to put on this session to celebrate Angus and Brenda's life and work. We, you know, for us, especially happening in their beloved Bath, where they lived since 1966, and where so many important things of their lives took place. This is, you know, really, really marvelous. And it's precise. This event is precisely the kind of event that they would, you know, really have loved. And they loved conferences. They loved all of the, you know, the friendships and the you know, the interaction and the fun, as well as the serious business. And they always got down to that as well. Anyway, I must say that sort of sharing a panel with these three legends of industrial archaeology, I feel a bit of an imposter. And I thought I'd better really start off by, you know, showing you my credentials. So here we are. So yes, those of you who know this famous book, Industrial Archaeology in Britain, I was the boy in the cooking pot. I think it was one of yours, Neil, wasn't it? Coalbrookdale. Yeah, so I was a good fit. I was there to give a sense of perspective and size, I'm sure. But yeah, I mean, very much my perspective, I mean, I was born in 1960, so my perspective of what we've been hearing about is really a child's perspective. And I was growing up at the time of those early bias outings. And a lot of my memories are, still very vivid. I remember going to, was it Barry Docks, and this kind of steam engine graveyard, and certainly from my child's eyes, these rusting steam engines stretching as far as the eye could see. I remember watching the Great Britain come through Avon Gorge. I remember playing on an amazing train set in Tom Rolt's garden. In the summer, as a summer job when I was a bit older, Dad got me to do some filing of George Watkins' photos, and I was in an office with George. It was quite an experience, and trying to figure out his rather quirky filing system. And I said, well, George, what's this one? It says MT, and he's, empty. There's nothing in it. So, these are the kinds of things one had to deal with. But he was a really remarkable man, and I have to say that Julia and I still have his lovely armchairs that we're using down to the present day, we inherited from my parents' house. Some of the visits with the early industrial archaeology days were memorable for the wrong reasons, I think. I remember Dad leading us on a visit once, I was probably about 5 or 6, to visit a windmill he wanted to see, and a man appearing brandishing a hammer and chasing us off the estate, And on another occasion, that became known as the Nasty Man Windmill. I don't know what is in the gazetteers, but that's how we referred to it. Another occasion, we went to a kind of tweed mill somewhere. And I remember listening to this, what seemed to me a rather boring talk by the chap who owned it. But I became increasingly mesmerized by these 3 lights, the red, orange, and green. And after a while, there's this guy droned on. I couldn't resist it anymore. I pressed the green, and the whole factory seemed to judder into life, and everyone was very alarmed. So that was very much my take on it. But I suppose one correction would be that Dad always said that it was Andy and I who made him go to visit these old mills and water mills and that kind of thing. It's actually untrue. I mean, we'd be much more likely to be saying, let's go to a castle or a battlefield or whatever. And that we both become historians, and I'm afraid not industrial historians, but there we go. Okay, well, more seriously, I want to say something about a very concrete legacy that Angus and Brenda have left. I mean, the events of April to June 2020 were very traumatic. As you can imagine, we lost both parents within 2 months. At the height of the lockdown, and I'm sure many of you were familiar with the fact that only 7 people could attend Mum's funeral, so it was streamed live, and a few more for Dad's funeral, and so on. But again, it was streamed live, and I'm sure some of you will have participated, for which many thanks. But at the end of that, Andy was over from the States. He delivered a marvelous eulogy for Dad. And at the end of that, we sat down in this house, and I had Andy for a week. And we both knew the house would be sold. And we had this big problem. It was just full to the gunnels of books, of papers, documents, artifacts, all sorts of stuff. And we had to think about what to do with it. Dad had never really engaged with the idea of giving his papers to an archive. He was very, very sort of diffident about that. Likewise, Mum. And so we started, going through this stuff, and I think our hearts really sank when we pulled out a file to do with a family holiday to the States in 1968, all in immaculate detail, the accommodation and so on. Even the air sick bags from Pan Am kept, So there were people who threw nothing away. So you can see the size of the task. So we were absolutely delighted to receive a message from Lizzie Richmond, the archivist at the University of Bath, saying that the archive here would be very interested in taking the papers, Dad's papers, initially, but of course then also the archive also they're very interested in taking Mum's papers as well. So that you can imagine how that really transformed our task. And so we got to it and began sort of sorting things out. And over the next few months, van load after van load disappeared up here to the University of Bath. And Adrian Adoni, who's here today, and Adrian and Lizzie have been absolutely fantastic, doing a fantastic job in sorting these archives out. And Adrian is now at work on the definitive catalogue. So at some point, hopefully, this great work will be finished. But I can hardly begin to say how grateful we are to Lizzie and Adrian for taking the initiative on this and really giving a new life to this material that otherwise potentially might have been lost. I'd also like to record our gratitude to the Vice Chancellor at the University of Bath, Ian White, who was not only incredibly kind and supportive when my father died. I mean, Dad had been a founding member of staff at the University of Bath, and before that had taught at the forerunner of the University of Bath in Bristol, and also was very supportive of the creation of the archive, which is what we have in the image here. So what is in the archive? Most of it, or more of it, is on Angus's side, not least because, of course, he sat on so many committees, as you've been hearing, and they generate their own papers, and you've got minutes and documents and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of that, but at its core, Dad kept a diary, I think from about the age of 7 or 8 until his death. And latterly, certainly from the 1950s, there was one of those Let's page-a-day diaries of the kind that's in the display that Lizzie and Adrian have arranged. And so for each day, you'll have a full account. He'll sit down at the end of the day and write it. Generally, it's a very factual account. I mean, he wasn't a great one for psychological reflection, at least not in a diary. But it does mean that, you know, if you're interested in the history of industrial archaeology and the history of technology and that kind of thing, I think it'd be a goldmine for, you know, how things happened and what happened when and so on. But every facet of Dad's life is covered in the collection, really all the way from his childhood, juvenilia. One keeps on finding things. These are some little things that he must have drawn in 1944 for a calendar or something like that. You see on the right, the New Inn, Selsley. Selsley, which is on the edge of the Cotswolds, was very important to him. There was family there on his mother's side, and he was evacuated there at the start of the war. So it was always somewhere that he liked going back to and lived on in his memory. But every facet of Dad's life is in the archive. Andy and I actually found a note when we were going through these files where he'd written, "This is the best recorded childhood ever," which is slightly daunting. But, you know, I can see what he was getting at. So you'll find there, you know, his life in Sheffield, running the Linden Avenue Star Club at the age of about 8 or 9. You'll find obviously his military service in Singapore, his time at Cambridge as an undergrad, and then as a really quite an early doctoral postgraduate student. His Christian socialism, which took both him and Mum to London to St. Catherine's Foundation, where he was an adult education officer for 3 years in the mid to late 50s. And he also sat on the AIA, which itself generated a lot of papers. And then also it takes you to Bristol and then ultimately to Bath, and then the career that you've been hearing about. And so it's all there. I mean, different parts are represented to different degrees, but it's all there. There's also plenty on Mum's side as well. A lot of her research notes are there, which I know Adrian has been unpicking and sorting to make them accessible, especially her background work on the history of pioneering work on the history of gunpowder. You know, sadly, she didn't pull it all together in a single volume. She was working towards that when she died, but some little fragments of that survive on various memory sticks and that kind of thing. But also you'll see in her papers some of her diaries and some of her work for Bath history and for especially at Waltham Abbey, which Keith just alluded to. So, I mean, my hope is that this will make a fascinating resource if you're interested in any of these topics. You know, you'll find things of interest there, and so do please use it once it's fully catalogued. I mean, Andy and I joked. I mean, we're both historians, you know, so, you know, had a certain eye for this. And we both joked that there's at least 5 or 6 PhDs here, you know, depending on what your interests are. So, you know, we're kind of, you know, seeing it in that light. Just to give you an example of what's in the archive, I just want to make a quick quote from something I found. Things keep on popping out of books, you know. You'll open a book that I took from Bath and there's a letter or something in it. And I just want to cite this one. It's written to me in October of 1979. The occasion for the book is really that I'd just gone to Oxford, and Dad had also just published this book, History and Industrial Civilization. I think it's a very important book to Dad. I'm not sure how it went down more generally. We always just pull his leg because Dad had this sort of quite visionary thing about, you know, the future and where it's all going and how history could educate our sense of the future. We called it destiny, you know, make it very kind of portentous. And it must have been awful for him really having two boys doing history at Oxford when he was publishing these things. But anyway, you know, he took it in good part. But the letter starts, despite having the house to ourselves, life seems busier than ever. And of course, that's true, because after 79, I think really their life took off in very enriching ways. They spent 6 months in Australia, where they did a lot of work on the Australian engineers and that kind of thing. They spent time in China in 1984, which I think is that photo was taken in China, I believe. They spent time in Sweden, a country they really fell in love with. And again, we're looking at, you know, Swedish industrial archaeology and technological history. So I think 79 was a real turning point for them. Anyway, so the letter starts, or the bit I want to quote goes as follows. The week before last, Mum and I took advantage of a British Rail 2 for the price of 1 offer, the parsimony of the interwar generation, educating the young. A 2 for 1 offer to visit London. I had Newcomen business and Mum went to the university library. We met up in the evening for the Newcomen lecture, but left early as an industrial dispute had closed Paddington. You know, please, ça change. Last week, we had another day in London when I had National Trust business. There was a reception in the evening when the Trust received a French Conservation Award. And this gave me the chance to introduce Mum for the first time to some of my colleagues on the Properties Committee. Amongst the guests was Norman St. John Stevens. Mum greeted him by saying that the last time she saw him, he was being thrown into the River Cam in evening dress in 1949. He clearly remembered the occasion vividly. So it's only a little extract, but I think it really sort of captures a lot about them. I mean, they really were, you know, they really, you know, had so many different interests and commitments, but always living for the, you know, to get the most out of everything. You know, if you had a chance to get into a library or, you know, see some friends or whatever, they would do it. They were tremendous fun. And Mum was fearless. You know, the first thing she would say to someone famous would be, you know, I saw you in a kind of humiliating situation. And you know, that's the trick really of that kind of, you know, that incredible relationship they had. You know, you had Mum's, you know, boldness, and then Dad this kind of reserved, you know, diplomatic, you know, but they, you know, together it really worked, and they made a fantastic team, which is what everyone remembers, of course. So yeah, I mean, they were great fun. They really did everything for each other. Later on, of course, when Mum was at Waltham Abbey, Dad would act as her chauffeur. And that's a long drive from Bath to Waltham Abbey. Given he was, you know, this must be talking about the 1990s or early 2000s, you know. And some of the fellow committee members say, well, who was your chauffeur? This tall, dignified chap standing by the car, you know. So anyway, finally, I just want to just say something about, I mean, this is a very nice photograph. This is Baxter Mountain in the Adirondacks. So it's near where my brother lives, and, you know, a place that they always loved to visit whenever they could. I remember once they were meant to be going to Vancouver, and somehow managed to drop in on upstate New York, which is quite, you know, quite good going. But the thing is that you've heard a lot this morning about their contributions. You know, they've contributed a lot, you know, to industrial archaeology, the history of technology, and so on. But I just want to say that this works both ways, you know, that also they took tremendous pleasure from the connections in their life, you know, from the world of industrial archaeology. That means from all of you, especially from the people on the panel today who they've known, you know, forever. And there is this incredible two-way reciprocation there. This was their life, and they got a tremendous amount from it. It was a tremendously fulfilling life, and they loved every minute of it. So on their behalf, thank you.
Okay.
You're on.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is a very brief roundup of what has been a most stimulating morning. It's a huge pleasure for me and a great privilege to be able to reflect for a little while on the association that Angus and I, volume control. It's not on here, is it? Shall I start shouting? Is that a bit better? Right, okay. Okay. And it's a great privilege and pleasure to be able to add my threepence or so to the splendid 3 sessions that you've heard so far. I met Angus first in December 1964. I had just been appointed Curator of Technology at Bristol City Museum. There had never been a Curator of Technology at Bristol City Museum before, and the appointment was prompted by the ambitious programme of the City of Bristol to build a complete new city museum on the Wine Street site in the city. The overall design was by Sir Hugh Casson, and it included the bombed area near Bristol Bridge with the church tower in what would be the quadrangle of the museum, the survival of the Bristol, the area of Bristol that had been so comprehensively destroyed in the Blitz. And I'll take no notice of what is going on. Do enjoy the amusement behind me, though. And in order to develop this museum, the city invested in the staff of the museum, including the creation of this post of Curator of Technology. I'd only been in that post a month or 6 weeks when Angus turned up in my office in the museum and said, would I join him in an evening class course, which was taking place in the Folk House, which, if you remember, is about 2/3 of the way down Park Street, little hole in the wall, and you went in there, and it was a lecture theatre. And that began a lifetime of relationship, Angus and myself. Industrial archaeology was in its infancy. Its name was being questioned by delegates on this conference. We had about 30 people on this course every week. And in the summer, we set off to explore the sites in South Gloucestershire and North Somerset. And it was an extraordinary bonding to the extent that Angus and I were both feeling our feet as to what we were up to in the context of industrial archaeology. Now, I think the 3 speakers this morning have indicated to you the contagiousness of industrial archaeology. It is incurable, and Angus was one of the vectors of this disease throughout his life, and in particular in these early days in and around Bristol. I remember vividly the exploration of the tunnels at Priddy on the of the lead mines, but more memorable from that trip was that we all piled into the coach to get on our way back to Bristol and realized we left one of the members behind. Now, we're about Keynsham before anybody noticed their absence, turned the bus and set off back. And we found him by the glow of red anger, which suffused his face collected him and brought him back. And Angus, I remember, had a wonderful emollient effect in persuading this chap, not that this had been done deliberately, but that it was a genuine accident. So I have many personal memories of Angus. I remember, Tom, going to your house in Bristol. This was in the days when he was a lecturer at Bristol College of Science and Technology, and one's feet crunched on the ground of part made and part dismantled airfix kits. It was a sort of lair. And here and there was a complete aircraft, but the large majority were far from complete. I got the impression, because most of the remains of these things were in the entrance hall, that they'd started life from the top of the stairs and had failed to fly. And had possibly disintegrated when they hit the floor, but more likely, I think, where they were trodden on. And there were these lovely, and Brenda, of course, then, who, this was long before her interest in history and archaeology, but we saw Brenda and you two and Angus as a wonderful family unit. So Angus and I set about industrial archaeology with a vengeance, leading to the development of the Bristol Industrial Archaeology Society and the AIA, which grew out of the Bath conferences. And these merged one into another. It's quite difficult to disentangle the one from the other in those early days of the folk house courses. We went to see David Thomas in Newton Abbot. His office was in the upstairs of Newton Abbot railway station, which gave it an added cause of enthusiasm. So we had to get up and look out of the window to check on which Great Western Railway locomotive it was coming through, and then carry on the meeting afterwards. And he had at that stage launched what was supposed to be a regional series on the industrial archaeology of the British Isles. Now that disintegrated after a while. He did 1 or 2 regions, and then people like the Staffordshire one was county one, and we persuaded him that Bristol region was a region. He wanted a Somerset volume and a Gloucestershire volume, and he got this, which was the industrial archaeology of the Bristol region. And we spent ages touring, because of course nobody knew many of these sites, exploring these places, miles in Angus's Mini, I remember. And out of that grew what I think was a very rare volume, because in parallel with this industrial archaeology series, David Thomas had the idea of series of picture books of the same region. So this is Industrial History in Pictures, Bristol, although it includes North Somerset and South Shropshire. And that enabled us to start investigating the enormous visual sources which exist of this area. Most of those pictures are from historic collections, and Bristol and Bath, of course, enormously rich in. So this was a treasure trove. The sadness was, I don't think there was ever another book in the series. And I hope that wasn't a reflection of how well it had sold or not. But in parallel with this, Bias came into existence and had a sort of slight up and downer. He's very polite when arguing with me and others, was Angus. And he, by then, of course, had moved, as the University of Bath had set up, he'd moved from Bristol College of Science and Technology into the University of Bath. And we were setting up this society, which was to embrace the Bath and Bristol region. And Angus wanted it to be BBIS, the Bath and Bristol Industrial Archaeology Society, which had an ineffable logic about it, but denied the opportunity to have a title bias. And it took me a little while to persuade him that the 1B could be Bristol or Bath. And we, had a standoff of several days until he came round. I bullied him, actually, to be honest. And at the same time, we had the husband of Joan Day. Joan Day did this wonderful book on the history of brass making, and Roy used to accompany her on these trips into North Somerset, South Gloucestershire. And he was very interested in printing. And so out of it came bias in that typeface and processed blue, which has been the color scheme. This is one of the longest standing memories, if you like, of Angus, even though he disagreed with the title and the logo and so on. So that was another opportunity, and that's continued, and bias is in good health. It's a contributor to the publication of learned papers, I think I can reasonably say, on the archaeology, industrial archaeology of this part of the world. But a more tangible reflection of Angus's contribution could be found in this. Now, this is quite a rare book because this was published by the Science Museum in London to coincide with the visit of TICI, the International Congress on Industrial Heritage, which met in Britain in 2000. And the Science Museum produced this book to be presented to every delegate. And we worked out broadly how many delegates there were going to be and added a few. And every delegate got a copy of this. And the remainder, which was only a few dozen, I seem to remember, went on sale in the Science Museum shop where they were snapped up. Now, I checked yesterday, and if you go on ABE books, you can find a couple. They're very reasonably priced. But the critical bit is that it has a chapter which is a quite in-depth review by Angus, titled The Origins of Industrial Archaeology. And it is a wide-ranging and synoptic statement of industrial archaeology from its early days. It touches on the Euston Arch and its loss in the early 60s, and takes the story right through. And then the end of his chapter is a list of the publications which sprang out of industrial archaeology in the period from the early 60s down to the date of the Congress in 2000. The next chapter is by Keith Faulkner, and is about the changing perspective of recording. So it was quite an interesting document, that one. It never appeared in bookshops, which is one of the reasons for its scarcity, because it was intended to be a presentation volume for the Congress and for the members of the Congress, who by then numbered 200, 250, I think. So it was quite a large number of people. And flicking through my records, I found a few flyers for it. So you have one of them. You can't buy a copy, but you can find one, or you could yesterday on ABE site. So these are the sorts of little reminiscences that I have, which provide the icing on the cake of the much more fundamental memories of Angus and later on of Brenda in the period that I knew both of them. Brenda's interest in industrial archaeology, of course, centered around gunpowder, and she became a trustee of the Waltham Abbey Gunpowder Works. Science Museum, I was the director of the Science Museum by then, was accorded the opportunity to appoint a founder trustee of the Waltham Abbey Gunpowder Works, an extraordinary site, which if you haven't visited, lay aside a day or two. And it had a board of trustees, And the expertise in the trustee body on the history of gunpowder and gunpowder manufacture was Brenda. When she came to the end of her term of office in 2007, my successor as director of the Science Museum didn't regard it as anything in which the Science Museum should be engaged, the appointment of trustees to alien bodies of one sort or another. And so Brenda lost her place. That grieved her deeply, but Brenda, being Brenda, had the determination to make sure that they couldn't actually kick her out. There was no intention to, but she was being, so to speak, laid aside as part of the development. It's a tough site, and Brenda knew that, and she was determined that there would be some expertise in the history of gunpowder manufacture, which to an extent there still is. Brenda, of course, died a few weeks before Angus, and that drew a line under a whole series of aspects of history, which we've all enjoyed and known, and have been a most important part of our lives. And I think the archive being established in the university, and in particular Angus's immaculate notes, I seem to remember he collected the not airline sugar or anything as banal as that, but printed tea towels and stuff which had steam engines and other images on them, and they may well be in the archive here. So I think a generation, 2, 3, 4 generations ahead, people will come to that record, that archive, and have a very vivid picture of somebody who was a kind and charming friend who meticulously put into his writing and his diaries a record which I think has still to be properly written and exposed. Thank you. I think we were inviting questions, weren't we? Yeah.
We can pass it.
We can pass that around. Yeah.
Yes.
Really, we're sitting here waiting to see what will happen. Whether anybody has any questions for any of us or any reflections on Angus that they would like to contribute, we'd be glad to hear them. You have here probably people who knew him best, particularly his son. Or are you all bemused by all that? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Neil, for the recollection of the Airfix models. I mean, the interesting thing is
a high rate of destruction.
Yeah, that's right. The interesting thing is that early on, Andy and I think, actually didn't really know how to put them together. And Mum actually put them together with sellotape. Probably why they didn't fly. But it's only a while later we learned about that horrible glue that you used to stick them together. And then I'm sure things improved after that.
It was the number of them that I think shocked my wife and I. It was like a subsoil, so to speak, and putting your foot on the floor without crushing some wing or fuselage. I don't remember any of the glue, because of course smelling the glue was one of the not particularly beneficial parts of the process, and perhaps the sellotape was in order to avoid your being contaminated.
How many of our members, students, and
There must be members here, perhaps, or students of Angus. I suspect there are within the.
Peter Stanier.
There's one. There's
Yes,
one. Peter Stanier. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's keeping very quiet.
Yes, very true. Do you wish to add anything, Peter? Oh, it's a shame Bill's coming to you with the microphone. David wants one.
I did apply for the position on the course in I can't remember when, 73, 4, something like that. 73, and was going to study Bristol Gas Works. That seemed to be the most exciting thing in the world in those days for me. But about the time that he offered me a place, Margaret Weston offered me to pay for a place at Imperial College to do his technology course there. So I mean, I could still sit at the desk, nip over the road, do the course, come back and get on with the work. You know? So I didn't become his student, but he did act as my external examiner. So we kept in touch that way.
The support of the then director of the Science Museum, Sir David Follett, in the early days of the Bath conferences, he came to every one of them and followed 3 steps behind by Margaret Weston, who became the next director, and there was sort of a certain connection in that sense. Yes, and I succeeded Margaret Weston as director, so the generational connections there. But I remember going into Willsbridge Tunnel. David Follett turned up in a proper business suit with shiny black shoes, disappeared into Willsbridge Tunnel, and came out with his shoes in one hand and his socks in the other, and his trousers wet up to his shins. Took it in good part, rang out his socks, put them all on, and carried on with the conference. So he was an intrepid industrial archaeologist. And what was interesting was that he'd been a part of the Ancient Monuments Board and had seen its early connections with industrial archaeology, and this was his opportunity to enter into the practice of it. Dirt archaeology with a vengeance.
Tom actually mentioned about Angus and Brenda traveling up to London together when it's 2 for the price of 1. I benefited very much from that when we went to Bochum in Germany for the 2nd Industrial Heritage Committee, and the German railway went by train, and the German railways were doing something called a kleine Gruppe, and that allowed 3 people or more to travel for the price of just 2. So I traveled with Angus and Brenda as their child, more or less. I don't think I was breaking the rules, but you know, I had to only pay half fare.
There was a certain puritanical thread to Angus, because when we went to the Industrial Arktiki, the International Congress in Sweden, my colleague from Iron Bridge, we drove there, by the way, from Iron Bridge. He had a case of bells in the back of the car, well covered in old coats and anything else, because of
Bell's whiskey.
Bell's whiskey, yes, because you couldn't buy booze in Sweden in those days, other than with a government license and through government liquor shops. So Stuart became very popular indeed, and Angus frowned a bit at that. So we kept the whiskey consumption part of the Congress out of his sight.
At that Congress, I shared a room with Angus, and it was in June in northern Sweden, yeah. So it was 24 hours light, and I think Angus went to bed quite normally, quite reasonable time, but I usually went to bed as he was getting up. So, just because we're out looking at things, yeah. And I remember with Neil we had what was it? Which battle? Trafalgar, rowing boats on the lake at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Angus did join in that. This was a naval battle between Britain and the rest of the world in rowing boats on this wonderful lake. It's about 11 at night in blazing evening Swedish sunshine. And I remember John Robinson, who was on the staff of the Science Museum and responsible for the Science Museum's grant scheme, and also a lieutenant commander in the RNR, rowing in a very correct manner, this rowing boat across the horizon. And a little head appeared and caught up with the boat, hands on the transom, and out of the water popped Dominic Ferrier, topless, and John caught a crab with both oars simultaneously and fell on his back. Angus was present at that and did enjoy it. So, as we all did, in the two senses, one was the collapse of John Robinson into the bows of his boat, and the other one was the sight of Dominic Ferrier.
The water was very, very cold apart from the first 9 inches. It was a beautiful summer, and 9 inches might have been thing. As soon as you went up below that, it was about 32 degrees Fahrenheit.
Mary Mills.
We shouldn't be reminiscing in this manner, because I can see this disappearing into all sorts of nooks and crannies that don't deserve either discussion or exposure. But there is one there.
Yes. Mary, you have your hand up. Did you want to ask something?
I wanted to say very briefly that the gunpowder stuff didn't mention the Gunpowder Mill Study Group, which Brenda convened, in the newsletter she did, which brought in a lot of people like me, if you like, who had a minor interest in a gunpowder site. Lots and lots of people from all over. Can I also perhaps email Angus's son about Woolwich in the 1960s? Because I don't think it's anything that ought to be raised here, but something I'm quite interested in.
That's fine by me. You can find me if you Google me, because it's an Oxford address.
Okay, I'll do that.
Easy to find. Not because of the Tom Buchanan and the Great Gatsby, who's my very evil character, but so there is a bit of, yeah, but you won't be emailing the Great Gatsby man, I don't think.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all.
What I would like to do is just to follow a thread, an alternative thread. This goes back to 1970, where the White Hart and the Mauritania might ring a bell with those present. When Angus, and certainly all the late John Powell, Joan Day, Roy Day, all together, little did we realize that that was the start of a very strong social aspect to industrial archaeology. We didn't know where we were going then, and it was at a time when many of us had been doing industrial archaeology without realizing we were doing industrial archaeology. And from that nucleus, it does explain through the steps that we've heard about why we're here today in Bath. But I think it also explains why one of the reasons to come to conference is to be together and talk informally, as well as listen to the formal presentations. And I do like to think that that started in the pub of the night for Bias after the meetings in Bristol.
In the Mauritania, at the bottom.
Yes, in the Mauritania, and sometimes in the White Hart. It depended on the mood of the group.
Yes. The Mauritania, of course, was kitted out entirely with the panelling from the saloon of the Cunard liner. And I think he's still there, isn't it? Would you know? I think, oh, am I sharing it? Yeah, okay. You can share it, yes. No, no.
I think the final moment for this formal part of the conference before we go and catch the bus, as Michael Messenger, belongs to Zoe. You're the future.
I did not know that this was going to happen. Am I there? Hello, everyone. Thank you, Marilyn, and thank you, everybody, for coming along for the conference and for your very warm reception of me coming into the chairship. Massive, massive boots to fill. I think we can all agree. And I would be very proud and very happy, and Brandy and I were speaking about it only earlier today, if in 20 years' time we could be reflecting on another successful 20 years, hopefully. So the best thing that I could envisage is if everybody here could let people know about the association. If you would like to help out in any way, get involved and let us know. And I really hope that I will see you all at conference next year, and that you'll enjoy the programming that we've put together for you. Also, would anybody be open to a photograph of the 50th anniversary conference whilst we're all sat together? It's probably best to do an opt-out. So if you don't want to, please duck down or hold your programme in front of your head. Bill, you ought to be in the photo, really. Do you want me to take it?